Hello all. I would like to welcome you to our first lesson in your ninth grade physics class. Our first unit is on the tools of physics, which you can see the title of that unit here. And our first lesson is on experimental design. This is the first of a two-part lesson on experimental design. So this one is experimental design 1. The next one will be experimental design 2. Our standard and learning targets that we're working on here, you can see listed here. We want to be able to design and conduct a controlled experiment to collect data on the relationship between two variables. And the two learning targets that we'll be working on under this standard are being able to identify independent, dependent, and controlled variables. And we want to be able to explain why certain variables must be controlled in experiments. So we'll jump right ahead here, going into this first learning target. And in order to help us understand this, I just have a quick idea here about the purpose of experimentation. So anytime we experiments, they are always designed to determine the relationship between two variables. So for example, here are some questions that we might ask that would lead us to doing an experiment. And what I want you to notice here is that each of these questions is asking about the relationship between two things. So for example, the first question, how does the amount of sleep I get affect my attention span? So notice that's asking about two different variables. A, the amount of sleep you get, which you could measure, say, in hours, and B, your attention span, meaning how long you can pay attention to a particular lesson or whatever it is you might be trying to pay attention to. Again, two variables. Next question. What is the relationship between the amount of rainfall and the height of my green bean plants? So here we're looking at the relationship between how much rain we get and the height of our plants. Again, two variables. And then finally, the last example. If I study for more time, will that affect my grade? Now this one might not be quite as clear, but still notice we're asking about two variables. A, how much study time you put in, and B, your grade. So all of those would be questions that could lead us to doing an experiment. So here is an example of an experiment that we are going to use for the rest of this lesson. So the question is this. How does the height from which you drop a ball affect the amount of time it takes to hit the ground? So I want you to ask yourself this, and once you've asked yourself this question, pause the video and write down what you think the answer is. What are the two variables here that we're going to test? So pause the video, write down your answers. All right, so you've had a chance to consider this. Hopefully you have something similar to what I had. So the two variables here are the drop height, or the height from which we drop the ball, so something along those lines, and the time. How much time does it take from when we drop it until it hits the ground? So those are the two variables there. Next question. How would you actually perform this experiment? So I want you to think about that, and I want you to draw yourself a little picture of what that would look like. So pause the video and do that. So this might seem quite complex at first, or maybe you're not sure how to sketch the picture, but think of it this way. We're going to have some sort of ball. Now we're not told what type of ball it is. That makes no difference. You can think of any sort of ball you want, a basketball, a volleyball, maybe it's just some sort of bouncy ball, and you're going to have it some height above the ground. Now, if we're going to do this experiment, we're going to need to know how high off the ground it is. So you're going to choose some height, and then you're going to measure that height. So let's say you picked a height and it just so happened it was 1.5 meters. Now you didn't have to necessarily put it 1.5 meters off the ground. You could have chosen any height you wanted to, but as long as you chose a height and you measured it, you'd be good. Now from there, you're going to drop the ball, but when you do that, you have to start a timer, because we need to know how long it takes for that ball to go from the height that you chose, in this case 1.5 meters, until it hits the ground. So you're going to start a timer, and then you'll stop it when it hits the ground. So notice here I'm just making up some data here. I'm saying we held the ball 1.5 meters high, and it took 0.28 seconds to hit the ground from when I dropped it to whenever it hit the ground. Now, we can't just do the one height. If I want to answer this question, if I want to know how this drop height affects the fall time, I have to do more than one height. So I'm going to have to change the height. So when I look at my text here, I can say we choose and measure a height, hold the ball there, start a timer, drop the ball at the same time, stop the timer when it hits the ground, and then continue to test different heights. So once I've done one height, I need to choose a different height. I could go higher, I could go lower, but again, I would measure that new height. I'd time how long it took to hit the ground. So that's how we do this basic experiment. And we do another height, and actually, as we'll find out later, we would actually want to do at least 5 heights, but that's actually for a different lesson. So I'm still considering this same experiment. I want you to consider this question. Which variable, those two variables, the drop height or the fall time, which variable did you choose the value of? So I want you to pause the video and think about this. Which one did you choose what it was going to be, the drop height or the fall time? So when you're thinking about this, hopefully you realized you did not get to choose how long it took the ball to hit the ground. That was just simply you started the timer whenever you let go of the ball and you stopped it when it hit the ground. What you did choose was how high above the ground to hold it. So you chose the drop height. If you chose the drop height, that makes it the independent variable in the experiment. Now ask yourself the question, which variable did you not choose the value of? Again, pause the video and think about that. So when you did this, you did not get to choose how long it took the ball to hit the ground. You didn't choose, I'm gonna have the ball take 0.5 seconds to hit the ground. You just measured it. You let go of the ball, you started the timer at the same time, you stopped it when it hit the ground. So the time, that, because you didn't choose it, that is the dependent variable. So from this, we can develop a couple of definitions here for some variables. An independent variable in an experiment. This is the variable that gets manipulated by the experimenter. So if you're the one doing the experiment, you choose what it's going to be. Here's how I always remember that. If I am the experimenter, I change the independent variable. And notice the word independent starts with the letter I. So if I'm the experimenter, I get to change the independent variable. I choose what it is. Just like you get to choose what the drop height is. You can drop it from higher, from lower. Yes, you have to measure it, but you get to choose where to drop it from. The dependent variable, then, this is the outcome or the result variable. So think about the example experiment. The outcome of the experiment or the result of the experiment is that fall time. You don't get to choose what the fall time is. In other words, it is not manipulated by the experimenter. The only thing that happens is, yes, it will change, or it might change as you change the independent variable, but you don't get to decide what that value is going to be. That brings up the next question then. What about controlled variables? Because notice our learning target here at the top, we want to identify independent, dependent, and controlled variables. So let's go back to our experiment and see if we can figure out what we're talking about there. So the same experiment we've been talking about, again, we're asking the question, how does the height from which you drop a ball affect the amount of time it takes to hit the ground? And remember that variables or experiments, they only test the relationship between two variables. I mistyped that there, folks. This first word there should be experiments. I didn't catch that before I started recording here. So experiments test the relationship between only two variables. In this case, our variables are drop height and fall time. So I want you to consider this question. What would be some other variables other than the drop height that could affect the time it takes for the ball to hit the ground? So if you were to do this experiment differently, what else could you change other than drop height that might affect how long it takes the ball to hit the ground? I want you to pause the video and write down your thoughts. So here are some things I thought of. You might have thought of all these things. That's quite all right. You might have had some other things that I didn't think of. So, release velocity. In other words, how fast is the ball going when you let it go? Obviously, if you just hold on to it and drop it, it will take longer to hit the ground than if you throw it downwards, because it's going to be moving faster to start with, so it'll get to the ground faster. Perhaps the mass of the ball would affect it. If you had a heavier or a lighter ball, that could affect the fall time. Actually, as we'll learn later on in this class, it wouldn't, but maybe we might think that it would. The type of ball that you drop. So maybe you have a baseball versus a golf ball versus a ping pong ball. Or maybe you're just doing with a rock. Who knows? You know, it may not be an actual ball. You can do the same experiment with a rock. Maybe the wind would affect it. If you had a very high wind versus almost no wind, all those might affect the amount of time that it takes that ball to hit the ground. So in other words, if we're going to do this experiment and we're only going to test two variables, drop height and fall time, all of these other variables, like release velocity, the mass, the type, the wind, etc., those must all stay constant. They have to be the same every time we do the experiment. We call those variables controlled variables. So to finish our definitions here, we've defined independent and dependent variables. A controlled variable, these are variables that are held constant during an experiment. They are not allowed to change. So, looking back at our learning standards and targets here, we have now identified independent, dependent, and controlled variables. So now let's look at this next one. We want to be able to explain why certain variables must be controlled. Again, we'll keep using this same experiment. So I want you to consider this. If we change something other than the drop height, in other words, if we change the drop height and we change something else, like the release velocity. Maybe one time I dropped the ball, the next time I threw it down slowly, the next time I threw it down really fast. Would we be able to know for sure what caused the fall time to change? So if, in other words, I'm saying if we changed both the drop height and something else at the same time, would I then know what caused the fall time to change? The answer to that question is no, absolutely not. Because we changed more than one thing, I don't know which one of those, or maybe both of them caused a change in the fall time, but I don't know which one affected it in what way. So in other words, what we're saying here, and this is the important point of this, we can only test one independent and one dependent variable at a time. I can't change both drop height and the release velocity in the same experiment, because that would be two different independent variables. So, to answer our question or to look at our learning target to explain why certain variables must be controlled, controlled variables, they ensure that an experiment is testing the relationship between only two variables. If I have more than two variables, if I have more than one independent and one dependent variable, then I don't really have any experiment at all, because no experiment can test more than one of those at a time. All right, so here's a review question, and actually it's several questions here together, but I'm going to give you a different experiment, and I'll give you the questions all at once, and once you've read them, pause the video, write down your answers, and then play the video and see how your answers compare to mine. So here's the scenario. You want to perform an experiment to test the relationship between the amount of gas you put in your car and how far you can drive it before it runs out of gas. So think about how you might do that, and here are the questions. A, how would you perform this experiment? B, what is the independent variable here and how do you know? C, what is the dependent variable and how do you know? And D, what would be some variables you would need to control? All right, so pause the video, write down your answers, and play it, see how they compare. All right, so how would you perform the experiment? Well, this one might be a little more complex than the ball dropping experiment, but hopefully you have something along these lines. So you would need to put some gas in your car. Maybe you start with 1 gallon. Maybe it's half a gallon. Doesn't really matter, but you pick some amount of gas. You then drive it until it runs out of gas. And then from that, you measure, or perhaps more practically, you just look at the odometer and see how far you went, how many miles you went before you ran out of gas. Then you have to repeat that using a different amount of gas. So if you were to actually do this experiment, you'd probably want to bring some gas along in a gas container to put in your car so you could drive back to the gas station and get some more gas. So that's how you would perform it. So next question, what is the independent variable? Well, you have to ask yourself, which variable do you decide on as the experimenter? Do you get to decide on how much gas to put in your car, or do you get to decide on how far you go before you run out of gas? Well, the answer is the first one. You choose how much gas to put in your car, so that's the independent variable. And again, this is because you, as the one doing the experiment, you get to determine how much gas you put in the car. Next question. What is the dependent variable? How do you know? Well, ask yourself, what is the outcome, or what is the result of the experiment? Well, that's the distance the car goes. This is because that's the result. You do not get to decide how far the car goes as the experimenter. You just decide how much gas to put in the car, you then drive it, and you see how far you make it before you run out of gas. And last question, what would be some variables you would need to control? Now, there are all sorts of variables here you'd want to control. I just put down what I thought the most important ones would be. Hopefully you have something similar. So here are some things I wrote down. First of all, the speed you drive your car, because that has a huge effect on the fuel efficiency or the gas mileage. If you were to drive it really fast, you wouldn't make it nearly as far as if you drove it more slowly. So you would need to pick one speed to drive the car the whole time, maybe 55 miles per hour. And you wouldn't want to go any faster or slower than that for each different amount of gas. You would want to make sure that you drove on the same road in the same direction. Because, for example, if you drove on one road and it was mostly going up a hill, and then you drove on a different road going mostly downhill, then the one going downhill, you're going to make it farther because it doesn't take as much gas to go downhill. And then finally, probably the biggest one, and those first two are also very important, but would be to use the same car. Okay, you can't use one vehicle for the first amount of gas and then use a different vehicle for a different amount of gas. You have to have the same car so you can compare apples to apples. So that's really what controls are always about, being able to compare apples to apples. If I do the experiment one way and then I change the experiment with some sort of different set of controls, I'm not comparing apples to apples anymore. All right, so if we look back at our standard and learning targets here, we're starting to learn how to design a controlled experiment to collect data on the relationship between variables. And in this lesson, we looked at identifying or defining independent, dependent, and controlled variables. And we explained why certain variables must be controlled in experiments. In our next video, we'll take a look at how we actually collect data, what that will look like, and how we actually would go about running the experiment in terms of how much data we have to collect.